Is the Chinese goddess of the moon, and we'll explain some of the mythology behind that momentarily. This thing is about a third the size of the Apollo lunar module, but without anything around it to judge scale, except maybe for this obligatory national insignia. You can't really tell how big it is, but it's big. It weighed 2,600 pounds. That included, I believe, the rover. And it was automatically landed by computer control for the first time by the Chinese on December 14th, 2013. Well, as Robin intimated again, I've been working almost around the clock for a long time to try to figure out what were they up to. What were the Chinese trying to do by putting out extraordinary data and not calling attention to it? I mean, that's very non-dogmatic and non-propagandistic and non-everything that we have come to expect from, the Chinese communists, which intimated to me that what we're dealing with is a power structure inside the Chinese government, which is not what you and I would recognize as modern Chinese political philosophy. This seems to have much more to do with a slow drip of information to get people sensitized to when the announcement is made. The social media in the 21st century of electronics, the internet, the web, Twitter, which in Chinese is called Weibo for some reason, all of these tools for getting information out to people uncensored have come into play in terms of what the Chinese have done. So let me begin by showing you a graphic here. This is Chang, an artist's conception, obviously, and this guy in the background is Jade Rabbit. When Chang was banished to the moon eons ago, and there's a long story that goes with that I won't get into because it won't take us to the data and we need to take a look at the data. She was banished with one living soul other than herself in the mythologies, and that was this very special bunny, this rabbit, who spends all his time concocting elixirs of immortality on the moon. Now, if you've been watching what we have been looking at for the last 20, 30 years, painstakingly trying to put together a mosaic of what is really out there in the solar system, apart from what we're told is in the solar system, which is not exactly what is really there. What's interesting is that the Chinese apparently are dipping deeply into their own mythology to craft this mission, both in terms of the names of the protagonists and in terms of some of the things that are going to be made possible by what the Chinese have now gone to the moon and confirmed. This is the Chinese goddess's moon palace. In fact, I saw a news squib a couple of days ago from the official Chinese news agency. The Chinese are planning, ultimately, a human mission, actually a human expedition culminating in a lunar base, a lunar colony, and they're calling it Moon Palace 1. They're going to call it that. They haven't, done any of this yet, but they published some interesting plans based on what you can see of the data coming back from this mission, which is taking wild excursions, I can see. So I would all call your attention to this screen. Back up. Okay, there we are. All right. This is Jade Rabbit. In fact, if you look very carefully at, let's see, did I go too far forward? No, we're okay. You can see in the so-called man in the moon outlines of the ancient Maria, the waterless seas of the moon, a figure outlined. In the Western tradition, we call it the man in the moon, very chauvinistic. In the Eastern tradition, for some interesting reason, it is connected to a bunny rabbit. And the mythology of what the rabbit is doing on the moon gets back to the idea of immortality, unlimited potentials, all those things that are connected to the civilization that we now believe, based on this data, the Chinese have very obligingly confirmed once existed on the lunar surface. This is the first official image that was taken from the lander of the rabbit. I'm sorry, the second image. And this, in fact, is Jade Rabbit moving south from the landed position of Chang 3. And as you can see, the website, I got to stop doing that. The website which allows us to see this is from the People's Liberation Army. Now, the People's Liberation Army is the rock foundation on which modern China is built. Without the PLA, without Mao Zedong, without all of that history, the China of today would not exist. So what I thought was really striking is that this data was first communicated to the West, to the rest of the world, not through one of the Chinese news agencies, which are also Chinese government, but they don't have the lineal history and the gravitas of the Chinese army. But the fact is that when we come back to this image in a little while, you are going to be amazed at what the Chinese People's Liberation Army has leaked to the world. Obviously, there's got to be a reason. They haven't called attention. They haven't given, any kind of a recipe for how to extract the extraordinary data from this image that you're going to see shortly, but we will. So just kind of take a deep breath and be prepared for an amazing adventure. This is the image from, I think, the left stereo pan camera on the rover, on Jade Rabbit. And rather than make you wait till the very end, I thought I would pop this in right at the very beginning. This is the lander. Sorry. I don't really like this for the laser. I'll use this for the laser instead. There we are. Let's go back. And this is solar panels, camera masts, instrumentation, rocket engines, landing struts, gold mylar to protect it from the heat of the moon during the, or heat of the sun during the full noon on the moon. Peaky boo of the Chinese flag at the very left or the right side of the image. But it's this stuff which is stunning, which should not be there. And if you look carefully, you'll see there are vertical and horizontal striations. There's a geometry here. There is obviously stuff on this side of the screen, and there's not much, if anything, on this side of the screen. And all of this will be explained in due course, but frankly, if you know what you're looking at, this has got to be one of the most astonishing images in space history. Because all this stuff above the moon, with all this geometry, should not be there. And it certainly should not have been revealed to the world casually by the Chinese government media putting it out in every possible web connection and television show that they could reach during the previous, 3 or 4 months. So moving on, this is telling me, who has been watching NASA very carefully since I was, as Robin said, employed by Cronkite and CBS News to do that. And then later I was a consultant to the agency, and I was commissioned to write a book on space astronomy from Goddard. And I've got to say that as you look at these two space programs, the United States and China, unfortunately, China is in the ascendant, and NASA and the United States is not keeping time. We're not doing any of the things that one would expect us to be doing if, in fact, we were watching a major global power take what we found 50-some years ago and suppressed, when I say we, I'm talking about NASA. So in that political climate, what the Chinese have done is even more extraordinary, because they're basically on the verge of telling the world, this is what the Americans found decades ago and didn't tell you about, much to the shock of their citizens who believe that their government does not lie, tells the truth, shows everything to everybody. At least that's what the propaganda says. And that it's the Chinese who have gone and done something stunning, something absolutely geopolitically extraordinary. And we are watching the opening of this intricate four-dimensional chess game, the conclusion of which tonight I cannot tell you. I don't know where this is going to lead. I do know that the Obama administration has put in place certain technological tools to allow us to go and join the Chinese as full partners in prosecuting what this means for civilization. But again, I'm going to save the political stuff and some of the analysis for the very end, because I do want to get to show you the data. So we have Chang and Jade Rabbit on the moon, landing here on December 14th in a place where no human expeditions, either unmanned or manned, have landed for the last 50 years. A completely unknown new part of the moon to explore. These dark areas here and here and here are what we call the Maria, which were named after seas back when Galileo and his descendants used telescopes to look at the moon, realized it was a world, it was a planet like the Earth, but it looked a little bit different, and that little bit difference ultimately resolved to the fact that these seas do not hold water. They are airless and dry, totally bone dry lava fields, which apparently have upwelled from the interior of the moon after some major lunar global cataclysm, which punctured the crust and allowed internal mantle lavas to upwell to the surface and spread out in these various basins that are now called Mare Tranquillitatis, Mare Imbrium, Oceanus Procellarum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is Jade Rabbit in the moon, outlined in those dark maria, with his mortar and pestle, busily making elixirs for immortality. Now, the intimate wedding of these ideas in the Chinese mythology behind Chang, and in fact their entire unmanned lunar program, tells me that we're looking at multiple levels of a plan which could ultimately wind up with the human race learning a lot more in very short order if we find ancient libraries and records and some kind of electronic documentation, the archive of an entire ancient, now lost civilization, and the connection of immortality repeatedly in the Far Eastern tradition with the moon tells me, not convincingly, but intriguingly, that that may be the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. For instance, we all know that we live a brief, incredibly brief period of time on the planet, and then we go away. Is that foreordained? Is that in the DNA? Is that in the structure of life? Is that in the nature of human consciousness? Or is that merely an accident of entropy and or the tinkering and tampering with our genetic code by others, to where we are not allowed the lengthy and long lifespans that were normal when whoever lived here lived there? That's one of the things we're going to find out as we progress down this yellow brick road handed to us by the Chinese government. This is a profile of the actual landing by this amazing robot. They originally were going to go to a place called Sinus Iridum, and that translates from the Latin into the Bay of Rainbows in English. And then at the last minute, they did a kind of a bait and switch, and they landed hours early at a place where none of the experts and none of the pundits who were watching the Chinese space program thought they were going to land, which is the Sea of Rains, Mare Imbrium, and they flawlessly touched down in the afternoon on December 14th, inaugurating an interesting series of events that allowed the data I'm going to be showing you to ultimately come back. Now, this is a profile, and the projector still is too far to the left. We've got to move that projector so that it's more over in the center of the screen, because we're missing data over here that can we see it over here? Yeah. Okay, good. Well, we can, that's easy to fix. You just, rotate the pod, Hal. A little more, a little more, a little more, a little more. Okay, just center it up. Great, thank you. These are the instruments that are carried by the lander, and these are the instruments carried by Jade Rabbit, the rover. And as you can see, mixing our metaphors madly, these things are loaded for bear. They have extraordinary technology on board to do the kind of intensive synoptic science of amazing stuff on the moon, if there ever was amazing stuff on the moon. And lo and behold, there's amazing stuff on the moon, and there they are in an extraordinary position to literally, with 21st century technology, which is light years ahead of what the United States had back during Apollo and during the unmanned missions before it, the ability to analyze and to return data on structures that is going to ultimately, as we pursue this 4D chess game, change the world. I mean, there's no way it can't change the world. The only question in my mind is, how is it going to change the world? And again, I'm going to save the political analysis for the end. One of the first clues that I had that the Chinese were up to something really interesting was in this Chinese media website devoted to the lander, devoted to the landing, called Journey to the Moon. And in the bottom left-hand corner of the website display, there was this object. Anybody recognize what this object is? What kind of pyramid? A tetrahedron. Now, if anybody knows anything about our work, you know that a tetrahedron, as a geometric platonic solid, forms the foundation of our analysis and exploration of something called hyperdimensional torsion field physics. It is a kind of a solid construct frozen in time that is depicting in higher level waveform analysis the ebb and flow of energies in the ether, which is another term for the torsion field. And when I saw this on the Chinese website advertising the mission to the moon, I was frankly quite taken aback, because viewed from the mainstream, viewed from the Chinese papers that the Chinese have published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, both in their own country and in the rest of the world, viewed, given the presentations they make at major scientific conferences around the world, there was nothing connecting this geometric form with the lunar mission. Nothing at all. So why were they doing it? Well, obviously that was the question that I had to ask. Because in our work, the tetrahedron as a frozen in time 3D geometric form that is actually capturing a moment in the ebb and flow of wave energies in the torsion field, in the ether, is the centerpiece of our investigation of this physics for the last 20 or 30 years. For instance, on Jupiter, this is Jupiter, by the way, there is a great red spot, which, by the way, has been shrinking, and that shrinkage is another indication that the physics that we've talked about is changing and changing dramatically in a relatively brief period of time, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. But back when we started our work, we realized that if you were to incorporate inside Jupiter this geometric form, a tetrahedron, it predicted where the great red spot, a vortex which is mathematically related to the tetrahedron, should appear in the southern hemisphere in terms of an internal standing wave structure of energy vibrating in the fluids in the interior of Jupiter, which is liquid hydrogen at extraordinarily high and low temperatures simultaneously, depending upon how far down towards the core of Jupiter you go. So if you see a tetrahedron popping up anywhere, in my mind, that tetrahedron is kind of like a code key. It's kind of like a little acknowledgement of the physics. And again, to see it connected to this lunar mission really made no sense. I mean, here is the Great Red Spot. There is a story that appeared on space.com a few days ago showing how the spot has been shrinking at an extraordinary rate. This is in 1995, this is in 2009, and this is in 2014, and you can see it's gone. I mean, a generation is 20 years. This is something which has persisted for the entire history of astronomy. From the time that telescopes were invented in the early 1600s, 1610, 1609, when Galileo looked at the planets, the spot has been visible. 400 years, this thing has been churning and rotating, creating all kinds of interesting wave turbulence in its wake in the Jovian atmosphere, which is incredibly dynamic with storms and various belts moving in various directions at different relative speeds. But the idea that this thing should be a vortex that was maintained by a hyperdimensional connection in the planetary physics, and that now it is shrinking at an extraordinary rate for an astronomical phenomenon. I mean, 400 years is nothing compared to billions and billions of years in the solar system, as Carl used to say. And the idea that in our lifetime it could be gone is telling me profoundly that the dynamics and physics that have maintained this vortex are part of a larger changing hyperdimensional physics of the solar system that we have been talking about for the last 20 or 30 years. So this changing spot, this vortex, which is now a little bigger than the Earth, and it used to be like 3 times bigger than the Earth, it's an indicator, a leading indicator that the background, which everyone keeps assuming, when I say everyone, I'm talking about planetary scientists, is constant, is not. And that is really amazing information and confirmation of the alternative model, the HD torsion field model, that we've been proposing now for, a generation. Well, there's more. If you look at the next planet out, Saturn, this is a Cassini image of Saturn, one of thousands, tens of thousands of stunning images of the Saturn system. What you see in this image is something which was first seen by the Voyager spacecraft back in the 1980s. Around the north pole of Saturn, there appears to be a perfect hexagon in the clouds. And when we saw this, which was in '89, is when the first images from Voyager were released by NASA. And it took them a little bit of technical talent and genius to arrange to see a view like this. This is Cassini, but the view they got from Voyager approximated this, because even though they flew by along the rings and the equator, they were able to take northern views and patch them together in the computer so you could get an overhead shot of what the hexagon looked like. So we now know that the hexagon has been a stable feature in this solar system at least since the 1980s. Now that tells me that the physics of the spot and the physics of the hexagon, while related underneath, are actually showing us different stages of the change of the physics. Because as far as we can tell, the hexagon has not changed at all, even though the great red spot is diminishing, shrinking, getting smaller, and will ultimately apparently go away. Well, the closer you look, the more amazing this structure becomes. And anything having to do with geometry in the solar system, this is a false color view, again taken by Cassini, showing this extraordinary six-sided feature with a huge permanent cyclone, a hurricane, located right atop the geometric pole of Saturn. What's this guy doing there? That's a huge storm that is obviously a tremor in the force, a ripple in the field, something which is not, part of the rest of this matrix. But, and by the way, this is not the entire planet. This is a circle around the North Pole down to about 70 degrees latitude. So this is north, this is 70 degrees away from north, and there you have this amazing geometric form. Now, these are other versions of it. Here's another perspective view. This is another polar view showing in real color what it looks like. And this is a depiction of what we think is going on inside. Because if you take a hexagon and you turn it into 3D, it turns into two interlocking tetrahedrons. Surprise, surprise. So you've got geometries on two different giant planets in the same solar system, one planet apart, which is telling us that something about the fluid physics going on internally inside this planet is just as interesting and as remarkable and as informative as what's going on Jupiter. Now, this is a perspective taken looking over the North Pole. Again, in somewhat natural color, showing us these amazingly straight edges. By the way, the whole structure rotates posigrade in this direction. I'm sorry, this direction. But the clouds marking the hexagon are racing backwards and making the turns at 300 miles an hour. And this has been going on since at least Voyager took the first shot. The other day, out of the blue, that's not good for TV. You always have to think about television when you're up here. It's such a, Well, I left television 30 years ago, and look where I am, what I'm doing. NASA has revealed all of its data in one form or another through various electronic archives. And as computer technology like this laptop, courtesy of Bill Gates, has gotten better and better and better, and the apps and the algorithms have gotten more and more sophisticated, yet more transparent, so that people can just, use the technology without even knowing how a computer works, thank God. Various talented amateurs have used these archives to put together their own versions of the official NASA data. Now, the flyby of Neptune occurred in Voyager's mission in, I think it was August of 1989. And thousands of pictures came in and were stored. It's only now, with the rise of the web, the internet, social media, that amateurs can actually talk to each other. And because NASA has carefully posted all this stuff on their websites, they can download these images that are black and white originals. They can composite them. They can make color, because the images were taken through red, green, and blue filters, so the color would be available. And they can come up with their own rendition of the various historic flybys and encounters that NASA has given us over the last several decades. Well, this was done by one amateur astronomer in the last several days. And what he did was he focused on what you can see around the south pole of Neptune. As the spacecraft flew by, it flew in over the North Pole, curved down, and receded from the planet, and then looked back. So you're looking at a crescent Neptune with the sun way down here in the center of the solar system, several billion miles away. And this little crescent right here is Triton, the largest moon of Neptune. And yes, these things are rings. Now, if Voyager had had the technology we have now for space imaging, this picture could have been generated all as one click, one picture. Instead, this amateur astronomer had to take the images from the rings, the images taken of Triton, the images taken of Neptune, and put them all together in a mosaic such as you would have seen if you were riding on the spacecraft or if you actually had the technology on Voyager to take such an image instantaneously. So I want to be careful in how I represent this because it's real data. It's really what you would have seen, but it's a picture that Voyager itself did not take. It required the elements all put together into one final dramatic, and the stars are from one of the astronomy programs of where the stars would have been, based on the trajectory and JPL's computer record of the flight path and all that. So everything is real. All the Neptune stuff is real. The stars are part of a background astronomy program to show you, if you'd had really, really, really good eyesight, what you would have seen as the spacecraft flew by in August of '89, this distant planet that is now technically the farthest known planet from the sun. Pluto having been demoted in a very bizarre historical sequence, which we will not have time to go into now. But if you guys invite me back next year, I'll tell you all about what's going to happen with Pluto, which gets its first flyby in July of 2015, which means we'll just be in late May, a couple of months from seeing stunning new stuff at Pluto. I was asked by my publisher to actually do a paper or an article, or whatever you want to call it, a chapter in a book that's being written and published devoted to the Pluto encounter and the Pluto mythology and all that. And when I get back after this conference, I will complete it and send it to him. And it contains some interesting nuggets that if the Chinese have given us stunning entree to ancient extraterrestrial activities in the solar system on the moon, the Pluto mission could give us stunning confirmation, a la NASA, of the same stuff on Pluto, provided our space agency decides, like the Chinese, to suddenly let it all hang out. And it is bizarre in the 21st century, given our history, given who we are, given how Americans treasure freedom and individuality and telling the truth. That's our mythos. The fact that it's a Chinese government which is beating its hands down in the truth game. And that is not good in the short term, but it could be very exciting in the long term because, frankly, as the Founding Fathers knew, if you don't have competing forces, if you don't have an interlocking system of checks and balances, power will drive those in power to do absolutely terrible things in the name of all the things that most people hold dear and sacred, and in terms of their belief system attached to the history of their own nation. It's a really good thing in my mind that the Chinese have exposed the lies that NASA has been telling us for 50 years, because if it wasn't for somebody else on this planet to tell us the truth, NASA would just go on and on and on doing the same thing and expecting the same result. Which somewhere in there, there's an allusion to mental faculties and things like that, but we won't go in that direction. What we will do, however, is to go closer to Neptune and show you what they released in the form of data to an outside civilian to put together, that now NASA is saying, oh my gosh, gosh, look at that. This person may have found something. And this is what this amateur astronomer, whose name I believe is Rolf, I may have to check that, has found. What he has found on Neptune around the South Pole is a hexagon identical to the hexagon on Saturn. And that has sat in the archives since 1989, and nobody at NASA seemed to notice. Now, I find that, frankly, really amazing, because that's what these people were paid to do. They took all these pictures and put all this data on videotape and archived it so they could go back and look and analyze and generate papers and grad students and funding and all this. And you mean to tell me that since 89, 99, 2009, 2014, over a quarter of a century later, it's a random average guy that finds this stunning confirmation that the same internal HD physics going on in Saturn and Jupiter apparently is also going on inside Neptune. This is a comparison, and I flipped the Neptune hexagon so that you can see the geometry very similar to this geometry at Saturn, and you'll notice you're dealing with a different atmosphere, different opacities, different what they call transfer constants for, convection and the things that make clouds and makes the puffy white clouds that are part of the hexagon visible. But all in all, we have, by the way, the scale is the same, is accurate. So the size of Neptune, which is much smaller than Saturn, the hexagon occupies the same portion of the atmosphere that the hexagon on Saturn does, which tells us that the physics that's generating this geometry, this visible geometry inside, is also scaling proportional to the planet. And you ain't going to hear this out of NASA for I don't know how long. Then this brings us to the sun. Because as I've been saying for many, many years, this hyperdimensional torsion field physics, which is mandating the evolution and destiny of the planetary system we inhabit, starting with our star, the sun, is showing us indications of how this physics really rules the universe. That it's the unified field theory, ultimately, that physicists and astronomers have been seeking for a very long time. Now, in the sun, you have a star, a huge glowing ball of plasma, ostensibly fueled in the center by nuclear fusion, although that could be called into question with these new results. And you have what's called a 11-year periodic sunspot or solar activity cycle that takes 11 years for the sun to build up spottedness, to have coronal mass ejections and flares and prominence activity, and this waxes and wanes in a period of about 11 years, with the surface phenomenon moving relative to the equator, which is here, and the poles, which are here, so that activity starts at a high latitude, moves toward the equator, and it peaks every 11 years at 19.5 degrees, which is the numerical equivalent of the tetrahedron, because it is the circumscribed latitude of a tetrahedron inside a sphere with the points, the vertices, depicting where the energetic activity should take place, starting with planets like Jupiter, but ultimately culminating with the sun, which is a star, which is representative of 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy alone. So if this physics is what's really driving everything out there, then our backyard is a microcosm of the macrocosm, and one can extrapolate what we see in nearby objects to objects that we can't see yet, or that we only infer from very limited telescopic or spacecraft data that will get better as the technology progresses and the years unfold. Well, this shows you that inside the sun there must be some kind of a dynamic standing wave phenomenon rooted in the mathematics of the tetrahedron, in the vorticular motions of the plasma in that geometry, and the peak latitude of the activity on the surface at the peak latitude of, at the peak time of the sunspot cycle is this canonical 19.5 degrees north and south. So you put all that together, and that's the background for this little nondescript figure sitting there on the Chinese website, a tetrahedron, which is shouting something enormous about the Chinese mission that they are not discussing in public. In other words, it looked to me as if what the Chinese were doing was tipping off those in the know that there is this real physics with this at its base. And they were basically connecting what the objectives of this mission were going to find on the moon with the very physics oriented around the tetrahedron based on our own research. This is another diagram showing the location, originally intended location, of the Chang lander, which was supposed to be up in Sinus Iridium, which is this bay of rainbows, that little protuberance sticking out of Mare Imbrium, which is this basin here. In their polar orbit, as they orbited the moon on the afternoon of December 14th, they suddenly fired the rocket engines. They told this thing to land, and it landed here as opposed to here. And that landing site was stunningly confirmatory of everything I have just told you, because the landing site of Chang 3 on the moon is 19.51 degrees west and 44.12 degrees north. In other words, they built into their secret leak by landing at 19.5, yes, this mission is secretly looking at the hyperdimensional torsion field model. Take that, you guys in the West. No, I'm very serious. This is high-level geopolitical 4D chess. And when I get to the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, you're not going to believe what you're going to hear, but it's on the record. I can point you to sources. This is not stuff we're making up. This is stuff that anybody with a laptop can confirm. So, this, of course, told me intimately that the double tetrahedron's significance of the physics was being communicated to the world by the very choice of the landing site of Chang 3 as a representation to those who knew what they were looking at of the next shoe the Chinese were preparing to drop as part of this larger mosaic of the real solar system, as opposed to the, I won't say fake solar system that NASA has shown us. Let's just say the abridged version of the real solar system. And again, I am blown away that it's a Chinese Communist government doing this, while our guys, who pride themselves on 200 plus years of freedom and individuality, have been steadfastly lying to everybody for almost half a century. What is wrong with this picture? And is what's happening now going to correct it? I'll get into some other implications of the landing site shortly, but let's move on. So we've got a landing at 19.5. I love saying that. It's just such an affirmation of what we've been trying to get people to pay attention to for decades. And it's nobodies that did this. This is the Chinese. This is the first images of both spacecraft taken by each other on the 15th of December, a few hours after the landing. This is the lander, Chang 3. This is Jade Rabbit, the little rover, solar panels, wheels, obligatory Chinese flag, parabolic dish antenna, the two cameras on top of the dish antenna, single camera on top of the lander, solar panels, legs, rockets, and lots of instrumentation in both at 19.5. I mean, that's really mind-boggling. Now, all my critics, and I have legions of them, they have been saying for years that I'm just nuts about this, that I'm into numerology and that I'm, obviously hoaxing whatever data I present. I mean, the things they say about me are worse than the things that Donald Sterling said about other people. The fact of the matter is the Chinese rode to the rescue and landed their damn spacecraft at 19.5. So take that, you critics. How do you explain that? Remember, there are only 4 places on the moon where you can land at 19.5. You can land 19.5 east, or 19.5 west, or 19.5 north, or 19.5 south. Now, given that the moon has a surface area approaching something like all of the continents of Earth combined, something like 15 million square miles, what do you think the odds are that you would just randomly find yourself, oh my God, we landed at 19.5. Well, how did that happen? So, it happened because someone wanted it to happen as part of a larger tale. And I'm not sure what that did. Oh, there we are. Okay. This is now a view as Chang was descending. They did an amazing job in covering it live. And I wrote a paper, a very long paper, which Robin was alluding to earlier. It's a thing that took many, many months to put together, which is now on the Enterprise Mission website, enterprisemission.com. Just look for the Chinese paper on the Chang 3 landing. There's a banner on the front page, what the Chinese really discovered on the moon. You click on that, takes you to the paper, and you'll see that the Chinese have been very inconsistent in the things they have revealed. Like, you can't hide the landing site, right? It's kind of naked and out there. But what they did is they misdirected everybody by saying they were going to land here, and they landed here at 19.5. And they didn't announce it until they landed. So they didn't want anybody to know what they were really up to until they actually sprung the trap. The trap leading to what? That's the question. So you're now a few hundred feet above the landing site. There's a 60-foot crater to the north. The lander actually set down about here, as you're going to see. There's interesting features sticking up. This one we'll talk about in great length later. There's a bunch of rocks on the rim of this crater, which are pretty weird. This is part of the lander. This is part of the actual landing legs of the Chang 3 lander. So it's taking a stream of video, sending it back live. The Chinese, to their credit, posted it live. You actually saw these individual frames coming back to Earth live, which for a Chinese communist government was kind of interesting. They'd never done that before. Their space program is immersed behind layers and layers and layers of partial information, some truths. On this mission, they published more hard data about the technology of the robot, Rabbit, and the Chang lander than they have ever published about any of their space activities before. Kind of like part of the, well, if you know what we can do, it gives you an ability to analyze what we have done, even if we don't say anything. So again, we're back to the idea of a social media plan that involves everybody on the planet who understands the potential of what they're seeing as part of the mission. This is now from Pokken, which is a Chinese website which actually does some really, really interesting graphics. A depiction of the actual lander. Here's Chang over here. Here's Little Rabbit after it was deployed on the 15th. Here's this crater. The thing about this crater is, as soon as we saw the first pictures, it kind of confirmed what the tetrahedron confirmed. This is not your normal unmanned mainstream planetary landing, even though that's how it was billed. There's something else going on. There's something else driving the Chinese to make public what they're making public. And this was that first picture. Thank you. Anyway, was that Morala? Yes? No? Yes. Oh, okay. She obviously has a comment. Okay. So you look out to the north and you see this crater, and all along the rim there were these remarkable objects which, even though they're called rocks by the press and by the media and even by the Chinese officially, they do not look like normal rocks. For instance, they have geometry. They have sharp edges. They have multiple levels. They have little holes, little symmetrical thingies. And their color really is bizarre because it's blue. Who in their right mind would produce blue rocks on the moon? What were the blue rocks trying to tell us? Well, let's move on. It wasn't until, let me see, the 11th of January, which is now almost a month after the landing, that the Chinese released their first really high-res version of a panorama showing what had happened in the ensuing time between the 14th of December and the middle of the first week in January of 2014. And you can see that there are various versions of the little robot moving further and further away as it was captured in various segments of this panorama. This is all the stuff in the foreground is Chang 3, the lander, and here's Jade Rabbit, leaving little marks. You see the little marks left in the soil? And there's the crater behind it. There's all those funny little rocks. Well, the closer we look, the more intrigued I became with the rocks initially, because they just did not seem like they should have appeared to a normal unmanned mission looking at natural geology. They had too much geometry and that peculiar blue color. Now, by the time the Chinese produced this panorama, they changed the color. Now, when I get a little further down the road in the story, I'm going to explain to you what appears to be contradictory behavior. But right here, this was put together by a guy named Ken Kramer, who's at universe.com. He did a really good job. And it is a time-lapse color panorama because obviously there are two rovers. The rover was deployed, rolled up, turned around, obligatory picture of flag on the front of the rover, then rover moved around to this position where they took more pictures, then it moved over here, then it moved over here, then it moved south. So this is basically a snapshot, a slice in time of the rover's activities in the first couple of weeks after the landing. There is more. If you look very carefully at this portion of the panorama, this is a crater, a very large crater, something like 450 meters across. If you don't understand meters, just to multiply by 3, because a meter is almost a yard. So 3 times 400. This is over 1,000 feet wide. And right over here was something which captured my attention because it looked, for all the world, like a pyramid. A real, honest-to-God Chinese image of a pyramid on the moon. And nowhere has anybody talked about it. There is one line from the official Chinese press agency, which was giving out stories early on in December of 2013. But after that, all reference to the pyramid on the moon, which is right next to the landing. It's literally 130 feet away, 42 meters away, to the southwest of the landing. Photoshop called Equalize. What Equalize does is to try to make the black stuff as bright as the light stuff. That's why it's called Equalize. tries to make them equal. And lo and behold, instantly popped up this stunning geometry, which, as you'll see in a moment, is identical to what the Apollo astronauts photographed decades ago that NASA has ruthlessly suppressed, with a totally different technology, a totally different political philosophy, and plastering the official website address of the Chinese People's Liberation Army right on top of it, like to call attention that this is the important stuff. Look there. This is it in close-up. This is what you just saw in close-up, and this is what happens when you do a little bit of sharpening and light modifications. These arrows I put in, they show the vertical striations of the glass going this way, and these show the horizontal striations going this way and this way. There is no way this can be A, natural, B, expected, C, unspectacular, and D, not destined to change the world. Because nothing like this on the moon should possibly exist. Well, we'll get to that. Now, the reason I have this very nice vintage image up here of the Manned Spacecraft Center is that we have a friend, Robin and I. His name is Ken Johnston, Jr., actually. He is a former NASA test astronaut. And in 1995, when I met Ken in Seattle at a conference, he came up to me after my presentation, which, by the way, was not on Mars, on the moon, it was on Mars. And he said, you got a few minutes? I've got some things I kind of want to show you. You might be interested. So he showed us a few things, and we dropped everything we had planned to do, and we trekked down to his house, which was south of Seattle, about an hour down. And lo and behold, there in his den were notebook after notebook after notebook of prints and negatives that he had carefully salvaged from the Apollo program, which was run by the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center back in the 60s and 70s. The program which sent human beings to the moon and returned them on this extraordinary vehicle, the Saturn V. Well, this guy, Ken Johnston, who was at a conference that we had a few years ago, I think this was at Joshua Tree. He's wearing, his kind of quasi-NASA uniform. Ken Johnston had been ordered by his superiors at the Manned Spacecraft Center, specifically at the Lunar Receiving Lab, which was a facility NASA set up under the Act of Congress that was designed to bring together all of the data, meaning the films the astronauts took, the rock samples they brought back, the analyses of the various instruments, the ALSEPs and the seismic data, and the atmosphere sniffing, spectrometers and all that the astronauts had left behind in these operating scientific packages fueled by nuclear energy, ALSEP nuclear radioisotope thermoelectric generators provided the electricity. And Ken, at that time, back in 1971, I think he was a year younger than I was at CBS. So if I was 23, he was 22. And they had put him in charge of the imagery and the rock samples for the scientists all over the world that would be getting the data from NASA as part of their contracts to analyze the Apollo samples and the context of those samples, which was the photography. Well, lo and behold, one day, his superior came into his office and told Ken, without telling him any reason, to destroy, not to give, not to loan, not to provide to a university or a school or a network or anybody, but to destroy all the copies of the Apollo films under his curatorial archive, except for one. To destroy this information. Now, when I think of the tragedy this represents, the mind boggles. It simply boggles. And we spent $20 billion in 1969 to send human beings to the moon. We killed some en route. You know, people like, the Apollo 1 fire and other astronauts who died in various accidents in aircraft as they were training to make the journey. The idea that with all that incredible information bought at the price of both treasure and blood of Americans, that some bureaucrat would be telling Johnston to destroy this information, to destroy the copies, not take them out to a dumpster, but burn them, literally eradicate them from the universe. Well, something in Ken's 22-year-old mind, young Marine, told him this is just wrong. Now, I got to say, having lived through that time, to me, that has given me an extraordinary appreciation for Ken's moral rectitude. Because frankly, if someone had come to me as part of the heady thing we were undergoing at CBS, linked intimately with all the NASA stuff going on, and they'd said, Hoagland, for the betterment of the program or whatever, you got to get rid of this stuff. We'll keep a copy, but you got to get rid of all. I don't know whether I would have had the perspicacity or the insight or the moral pause to say to myself, this is wrong. So I'm in great admiration that Ken Johnston, at the tender age of 22, knew this was wrong. So what did he do? He took in a gunny sack, Marines, gunny sacks. He took a set of all the Apollo film he could carry literally out to his car, put it in the trunk, and drove off and gave it to his alma mater, his own university, which of course promptly lost it. We tried. We really went and looked, and nobody knows. I'm just thinking maybe NASA watched what he was doing, and then when he had, they simply took it back. But he kept some of it with him. And if you know anything about life in the Marine Corps, or life in the service, they moved a lot. And over decades, move after move, post after position after post, Ken took these small sample of the much bigger treasure with him, house to house, move to move, state to state. I mean, he ultimately wound up going from Houston all the way up to Seattle working for Boeing. That's how we met. He was working as a aircraft instructor and a maintenance engineer on the systems for the Boeing 737. So we went down to his house and we were given a chance to look at what he had preserved. Now, what he had preserved was in the form of prints and negatives taken by the astronauts on the moon with a modified Hasselblad film camera. Now, you guys know what film is. When I give these presentations to a lot of, shall we say, a different generation, they look and they say, what's a film? Does it, how many views does it have? How many pixels, etc. But no, this was film. And this is the camera. This is an actual cross-section of the camera with 70mm magazines, excellent Nikon lenses, electrical, motorized, kind of space-ready by NASA because they made some modifications to the Swedish Hasselblad. For instance, there was no reflex viewing system. The astronaut basically used their body to point and shoot, and people have said afterwards, well, how in the world did they manage to get so many amazing pictures? That's a whole separate story having to do with the kind of film that I know was taken to the moon. And I would digress into that fascinating story because I actually got to use some of it and test it myself, but it would mean we'd be here until about midnight, and I don't think you really want to do that. So, what Ken's prints, particularly 9301 from the Apollo 14 mission showed was a normal view of the moon taken on a Hasselblad 70mm negative. This is Ed Mitchell, Captain Ed Mitchell, who was second in command in the lunar module to Alan Shepard during Apollo 14. They landed in, what was it, January of 71. No, February of 71. This looks like just a normal picture where you've got bright lunar surface, lots and lots of craters, and a dark lunar sky. Well, decades before, literally decades before the Chinese landed on the moon and took their CCD imaging, which is totally digital, I was able to scan this print that Ken had graciously loaned me among a whole bunch of other stuff, and lo and behold, this is what showed up. On the Apollo 14 image of Ed Mitchell putting up the TV camera showed the stunning vertical and horizontal glass geometry of the ancient lunar domes. On photographs that had been kept out of the weird and, kind of distortion-prone fingers of NASA, kept in a separate archive, separate from the agency for over a generation, until Ken and I met one Sunday afternoon and he said, "Would you like to borrow some of these?" And of course, this is what you see. Now, what you're looking at is layers of glass. The more you look at this image, the more you can see details, refractions, you can see buttressing. I mean, I don't have time to show you everything that's here because, again, it would take much too long. What's crucial to remember is that if you compare them side by side, there's a vague hint on the original of some kind of light in the sky. Now, it's not sunlight. It's not light scattering a lens. Why? Because look at the shadow in this crater. Look at Mitchell's shadow. The sun is way over here. It's nowhere near the lens. So what is causing all this stunning, beautiful geometry? Well, when you compare the lunar landscape as photographed by Chang 3, with what Ken photographed, or didn't photograph, but preserved from the Apollo archive decades ago, there is a one-to-one correlation across decades, across film, across CCDs, across politics. In other words, there is no possible explanation for what the Chinese have given us. The Chinese Army has given us, other than total confirmation of what Ken Johnson preserved against a direct order by NASA to destroy almost 50 years ago. And that's what makes what the Chinese have done incredibly historic and incredibly provocative in the geopolitical world stage, because it's like they are challenging the gatekeepers and the censors at NASA in the West to basically put up or shut up. This is the beginning of something tremendous, a change of the phase state of politics on this planet because of independent confirmation that, yes, we are not alone. And that is ultimately going to change everything. Now, the rate at which it changes it is going to be, very debatable, and we can have fun arguing that at the end of this talk. These other images are separate photographs currently in the NASA archive in Washington, D.C., in digital form out of NASA headquarters, showing 9301, which is the same frame that Ken had preserved. This is what NASA's official version now looks like in the archive. There are hints that there's something there, but it's totally degraded. It's totally blurry. It's out of focus. It's gone through umpteen analog copying versions before they made a digital copy to scan and put on the web. Oh, and this version over here is another frame. And if I can look carefully, this is, actually I can't see it. Hang on, let me go see. 9270 is that frame number. That is a frame taken on the opposite side of the LEM looking north by Alan Shepard at the same stuff. So these two pictures, this one and this one, are separate, but they show the same configuration in 3 separate versions currently available, 2 of them on NASA's websites. This incredible high-resolution, pristine, astonishingly detailed photograph is all that is left so far of what NASA actually recorded during the Apollo 14 mission, because all the rest of the photographs, per his supervisor, were destroyed. Is this any way to treat the American taxpayer? Now, having this data in hand, we fast forward the film. I love saying that because it actually is true. And we go and look at the other Apollo missions that have now been posted on the NASA servers in electronic digital form, obviously scanned from negatives and or prints of the original Apollo photography. And you can see that there is geometry in the sky and gridding on Apollo 15. There's gridding and geometry on Apollo 16 and on Apollo 17. It's particularly clear here. You can see the vertical and horizontal. And again, it matches the geometry that we're seeing on the Chinese data to an exquisite degree. Now, the critics, this is another version of the Chinese image that was produced by a British friend of mine, a colleague who I've known for a couple of decades. He runs a website. He did an analysis of the data going onto the Chinese Army website, downloading the original, using his own algorithms, his own techniques, and this is what he came up with, which again is an eerie analog to Ken's image, the Apollo 15, 16, and 17 data on what's in the sky, the grid work. We're looking at geometric structures made of glass, part of a huge dome over this portion of the moon, and this portion, and this portion, and this portion, which allowed air to be kept inside, heat and light, life support, environmental. In other words, you're looking at the ability of whoever was living on the moon to live in a natural environment underneath an incredibly complex glass dome that kept the air in and the vacuum out. And the scale and the scope and the number of square miles this stuff covers on the lunar surface is absolutely mind-boggling. It is obvious this was not done by a culture with our technical competence, or the Chinese, or the Russians, or anybody on Earth now. This appears to be the work of a civilization, an ancient high-tech civilization that can best be discussed or analyzed or compared to the supremely sophisticated civilizations that people like the Russian astrophysicist Kardashev described, or Michio Kaku has adopted and talked about at great length, a Type 2 solar system-wide high-tech civilization that literally can remake the surface of entire planets to make them suitable for habitation by, for instance, putting a dome over this region of Mare Imbrium, the remnants now showing the same identical horizontal and vertical glass structures that we're seeing in these archived Apollo images that are available on the NASA website. All you got to do is download those images and apply, imaging algorithms, and you will pop up the background and it shows you the same geometry. Again, none of this should be there. We have seen time and time again that images taken by the American space program show on the moon a pitch black sky and a dead gray landscape. It looks like those images may have been tinkered with just a bit, just a tad. And now, for some reason, the Chinese have landed 2 spacecraft. This is the rover, this is the little Jade Rabbit rover, and with the cameras here and the cameras on the lander, they have completely blown the doors off of that kind of cover-up. This, by the way, is just a little graphic showing the difference between a film image and a digital image, in which case the light comes through the lens, impacts a sensor called a CCD chip, produces lights and darks in a grid array, and so you have ultimately pictures taken by a totally different technical process as part of a chain of totally different technical processes, but they're both showing us the same thing that was seen on the Apollo prints that Ken had preserved decades ago. This is why I went on Coast and I said to George, this is a big, well, I didn't quite do a Biden on him, but I did say it was a big deal. Now, this is the picture taken of the lander as it was, parked not far from the position of the landing on the other side. You can see the ramp here and the first, turn, and then it went behind and then came around, and now it's in this position, and it takes this picture across the solar panel, showing again, you can see the horizontal and vertical lines, and also something pretty peculiar on the horizon that we'll talk about in a minute. It is the independent confirmation at every stage that makes me so excited about this data, because there's no way you can really, unless you're just nuts and just warp politically and you have a thing about, oh, the Chinese commies have got to be up to something no good. They must have faked this. I actually had a very long-time friend of mine who I've done some very interesting things with in this arena send me an email and it was like 2 lines. He said something like, what the Chinese have done is to confirm that all the Apollo images were faked, and the Apollo program was done in a studio in Nevada. Now, think about that. This is a sober, serious, rational guy who has been with me on this trek. In fact, this individual was one of the first people, along with myself and a couple of others, that Ken took to his house to show those preserved Apollo images. Obviously, his statement was totally political, because the idea now that the Chinese have confirmed that there are ancient structures on the moon made of glass with the same geometry as the astronauts photographed almost 50 years ago, I mean, this is not trivial. This does several huge things. For one thing, it completely validates the reality of the Apollo program itself. How could the Chinese take independent imagery of the same stuff that the astronauts took if both were supposed to be nothing more than fakes created in a fake lunar landing scenario? Are the Chinese actually faking sending a robot to the moon? Don't you think at some point that if they did that, they would be found out? Because if we go or we take pictures from orbit of the spot of real estate where the lander and the rover are supposed to be, and there's nothing there, well, that would kind of show the Chinese were idiots. And since saving face in the Far East is everything, why would the Chinese run the risk? What would be the benefit of pretending that they had photographed ancient lunar ruins when all they had done is to stage this in a sound studio somewhere in the suburbs of Beijing? It just makes no sense. It boggles my mind that a rational person who has actually followed this research from almost the beginning could give me that as a bottom line. The Chinese basically faked their mission just like Apollo. That is the name of a river in Egypt, I believe. Now, what's interesting is that other critics, a little more sophisticated, have claimed that what we're seeing in the sky here is nothing but noise, electronic noise in the CCDs. Well, it takes about 10 seconds to demolish that argument. A CCD is incredibly sensitive compared to film. Film that the astronauts used on the moon, it had a sensitivity of about 10 to 1, meaning it could take a picture of 2 objects that were differing in brightness by a factor of 10 and have both properly exposed. If you look at other lights in those images on the film, if it was brighter or darker, it either would not record or it would be overexposed. Whereas a CCD has what's called an incredible linearity, meaning across a huge range of brightness, something like 100,000 to 1. The image is linearly correlated with the brightness of the object in the scene. The electron flow producing the pixels is mirroring to this extraordinary degree, the 100,000 to 1, the actual scene that it's photographing. So the noise floor, meaning the noise of the chip that would be basically just random, like snow speckles when you turn your TV to a channel that doesn't have any signal and you see that random noise. That noise, of course, is present in this image, but it is such a low level. It is so far below what you're seeing here that the people who are trying to desperately claim now that Hoagland is just, amplifying noise, they're not playing with all 52. For one thing, the noise would not come with regular geometry. That's the other problem. Now, my friend Bob, who is the colleague in England who did the independent processing of this image, of the previous image, the PLA image, he did something else that's interesting. He looked in this version, which was taken by the rabbit. And by the way, in this close-up, you can actually see something on the horizon here. Does that look like some kind of a geometric structure? Yeah, it looks like a building. Well, it shouldn't be there. It's part of the larger glass. We think it's a buttress, because if I had the time, I would have put in side-by-side images showing the buttresses on the Apollo data compared to the buttress here, which is obviously partially destroyed. You got to look at a lot of these things to get something which is, still kind of visible. But what Robert did was he looked at the noise levels in the shadows. If you look down here at the bottom, you'll see there's a shadow of the lander. All right, there's no sun. Since overhead there's nothing but blank space, there should be nothing scattering light into the shadow. So where is the light coming from in the shadow, and why does it appear to fall off from left to right? There's no structure visible in the shadow over here. You begin to see some here. The more you go toward the outer envelope over here, the brighter the light in the shadow becomes. And this is really, really interesting and fascinating and much too technical for me to go into now, but we will go into it in part 2 of the paper on Enterprise as to why this is more confirmation that this is real. It's not noise, it's not electronic, background. It's real geometric stuff photographed by the lander and the rover. Well, what Robert did is he geometrically looked very carefully at what was happening with the light in the shadow under the lander compared to what was happening in the sky with the glass above the horizon. And he got a very nice lineation showing that the glass on this side is pretty much still there. The glass over here is not, and that's not vertical. That's a slanted line. You can see that's actually off the vertical by several degrees. He also found that if he applied the same algorithm in the same image simultaneously to what was going on in the shadow, he got a similar thing, but the sign was opposite. The angle bent in the opposite direction, like so, indicating that this was reflecting in the shadow here, giving you a double mirror reflection, which no noise would ever do. But a real set of glass structures photographed in the sky above the lunar horizon would in fact give you that. Now, why are we getting this bizarre reflection from the shadow? Why is the ground, the lunar soil, under the lander, not seeing any other sunlight because it's obviously in shadow and there's no atmosphere, so it should be pitch black? Why does it actually have a reflection of the dome? Because the Apollo astronauts, when they brought back the lunar samples, they reported, and you can find this in literature all over the world, just Google lunar dust or lunar fines or lunar regolith or lunar soil composition. Over half of the composition of the lunar soil is powdered, pulverized glass. So, no, this is a conventional screen where the light bounces in all directions because it's what's called a Lambert scatterer. Whereas if you got a Honeywell screen, which my grandfather was so proud of getting, if you sat where you guys are and you were with a projector behind you like this, you would get a really bright image because the little glass beads that were bonded to the screen in the paint actually reflected the light directly back to you. This is acting like a beaded screen, except all the lunar surface, having so much high content of pulverized glass, is acting in a fashion that produces a great surface for reflections of the structure of the dome overhead. And this shows both. This shows the analysis he did. This shows the results. So that alone, as I told him repeatedly in emails, I said, Bob, you have proved it's not noise. Noise would not be a mirror. Noise would not have mirror geometry. Noise would not have a complementary angle to that reflection between the edge of the dome here and the edge reflected under there. There's also this little guy. This to me is so interesting because we have another picture taken within a second or two of this one from the right-hand camera on the rover, and the right-hand camera on the rover doesn't show this at all. It's visible geometrically, it's past the panel, it should be here, actually it should be moved about over here, but it's not there. Now, if I have a camera and I've got one lens here and one lens here, that is a relatively tiny angle if this object is, let's say, several miles away on the horizon. Why would an object that was real, a three-dimensional object shining by reflected sunlight, why would it appear on only one camera and not the second image taken almost simultaneously? There's only one rational reason, and that is that the change of angle between the two cameras was enough to cause this to disappear behind the refraction of some of the foreground glass. And glass, as you know, bends light like a lens, and so if you move sideways, if you were to walk along and look at this stuff as you were basically looking at it, I don't want to fall down in a hole here, but if I was looking out like this at this and I'm walking back and forth, there must be incredibly complex optical things going on, like an optical picket fence, that cause the rays to move in strange directions as I change position, so that from just that far apart, the object here doesn't show up in the second picture. Which brings us back to the rocks. Because as I looked at the rocks and I looked at this incredible data, which the Chinese had now provided us, convincingly demonstrating overwhelming evidence that the domes do exist. The first picture that the lander took was this one after landing. This is an engineering camera. This is the high quality scientific camera. The frame here is what's marked in yellow here. So these objects, this thing here is this guy here, and this thing here is this guy here, and so on and so on. The resolution is much better in this version than in this version, but again, look at the color, blue and blue. So I began to think that what we might be looking at on this picture was nothing less than chunks of the glass from the domes fallen on Mare Imbrium, photographed by the lander and the rover. Wow. And it ain't ordinary glass, I'm going to show you. Now, they put out this picture on December 15th. On January 11th, remember, almost a month later, when they put out that nice high-res panorama, they also put out another picture of that same view. And I said to myself, now what? Now, this second image was digital. The first image was a projection off the screen. You can tell that by the light scattering in the sky above what should be a pitch black sky above a lunar horizon. Can't do anything with this image, which is why we couldn't. We had to wait. And lo and behold, whoever was leaking the data from inside the Chang mission, put out a digital version on the 11th of January of this year, showing all of this wonderful stuff. And when I equalized it, bingo. And this is impossible. What you are looking at are the remains of glass skyscrapers on the moon. Like here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And look at the colors. What we've definitely done is to tweak some of the color, which is perfectly legit. If the camera on the lander had recorded on the CCDs a color value for a pixel, if it was submerged in the general haze, the light haze, you suppress the haze, bring up the saturation a little bit, and lo and behold, you get to see what you're really seeing. This is so phenomenal. This is so astonishing. Here's a closer view. Now we're looking at not only organization, vertically and horizontally, but you can see that there's all kinds of geometric stuff which is lit up, shining either bright blue or red, having an overall internal geometric consistency which completely defies the idea we're looking at random snow in a TV picture. You don't get this kind of incredible geometry, horizontal, vertical, and in terms of detail, by simply looking at noise. And this now is a close-up of let me go back one. If you look at this little guy over here, if you do a little more image manipulation, meaning you suppress contrast, lights, darks, you change the gamma, the shape of the curves and all that, you can suppress the background, bring out the foreground data, and now you see there is a stunning regularity, not only in 2 dimensions, up, down, left, and right, but you're looking at a set of 3D objects. Come on, there you are. And look at what's hovering above the ground. The ground, of course, is totally overexposed because the brightness of this is very, 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 very faint. But it's only about 200 times dimmer than the landscape. If it was electronic noise, it should be 100,000 times dimmer before you get to see the noise, the speckles in the background CCD. So the fact that it's so bright, even though visually, if you've been on the moon, you would barely see it in bright sunlight, which of course could explain why all the astronauts claim, including Mitchell, that he never saw anything. Now, is Mitchell telling us the truth, or has he been carefully instructed, as per his military papers and oaths and contracts he signed as part of the Apollo program? Is he basically instructed to tell us that he saw nothing when in fact he saw something remarkable? I cannot tell you yes or no on that. I do not know. I strongly suspect that he did see what's there and he cannot tell us, because all of the astronauts have had various problems in remembering the details of what they saw and what they experienced, and this is all recounted in great detail in Dark Mission, The Secret History of NASA. But this looks so astonishing in terms of organization. I mean, these things look like remnants of skyscrapers, but that doesn't explain it totally, because even if you're looking at a skyscraper made out of glass, which is reflecting sunlight, scattering sunlight, where would these brilliant visible colors and geometries come from? Well, that brings us back to the physics. Because if there were materials in these structures which somehow, upon activation by sunlight, were able to store and release energy continuously for millions of years without any external power supply, or if they're hooked to some kind of hyperdimensional torsion field energy source that allows them to be energized even as the structure is whittling itself away and away and away because of micrometeorite bombardment. This is a comparison between what we see on the moon and the skyline of Atlanta, Georgia. First time I visited Atlanta, what I was struck by is how they had lighted up all of the skyscrapers, actually they put lights on the edges so that it looks eerily like this, except this is on Earth, and this is on the moon, and this is from China, and this should not exist. Now, looking at the moon has a very long history. It starts with, your naked eyeball, evolves to the telescope, then moves to, Jade Rabbit, sitting there with its two little cameras, left and right, its flag, its solar panels, its little wheels. Remember how initially, well, maybe you don't remember, but I will remind you to remember, when the Chinese landed on the 14th of December, they were talking about a 3-month lifetime for the rabbit, and the ability of it to travel as many as 3 kilometers from the touchdown point. 3 kilometers is almost 2 miles. Is there any possible way that something with little tinker toy wheels like this could go 3 miles? No. And in fact, it was not a surprise to any of us that the rover suddenly was immobilized by some technical fault very close to the lander within 4 weeks of the landing. To me, that says that the Chinese had 2 missions for Chang. One which was in public, promulgated by the news agencies, by the press releases, by the Chinese Academy of Science, by all the various, normal mainstream codices of scientific publication. And then they had a hidden agenda. They had a secret mission, which was to basically use this little guy to excavate or survey or analyze or probe that pyramid. We haven't forgotten about the pyramid, have we? And the glass structures that it sees on the distant horizon, and then compare those with whatever material was relatively close by through optical analysis. This is the 3-color system, red, green, blue, producing all colors including white. It also had the ability to photograph in black and white. And one of the interesting things I decided to do when I saw that previous image of the lunar skyscrapers, which A, should not be there, and B, why politically have they allowed us to see this? This is so incredibly over the top. This is so mind-boggling given the window into ancient solar system history that it now totally confirms. So what I did is I wanted to show you something about how astronomy has progressed. One of the ways that we look at images is we look at lights and darks. And this is a conventional astronomical photograph of M31. This is the closest galaxy to Earth, 2 million light years away, give or take. And this is an official analysis of various regions around it taken by terrestrial telescopes. This was the 4-meter telescope in southern Arizona, down by at a place called Kitt Peak, just outside Tucson. And I found this in the archive, and I wanted to show you that most of the time astronomers do not look at sky photographs like this. Why? Because there's something about the human eye-brain combination that allows detail to be much better seen if you're looking at dark on light. In other words, if I reverse this and I now have a negative, so I'm looking at the galaxy with all the bright stars as black, and space, you can actually see all kinds of subtle changes and star streams and density fluctuations and all that around what was previously a pretty normal image that doesn't allow you to see as much detail. What I decided to do was to take the same technique and apply it to the lunar skyscrapers. This is that image I showed you previously with the horizontal and vertical geometry. The lights, the colors, the various, this is normally as you would see it if you had supervision and could amplify the background about 200 times, so you see this stuff above the horizon. If we make it into a negative, this is what you get. Now you can clearly see where the structure ends and space, which is light on a negative, begins. And you can see that this vertical geometry has been eroded and abraded and shattered from the top down. So the base is more preserved than the upper levels. But you can now clearly see these vertical elements and the horizontal. And you can see also fascinating detail from the surface grading up, like we're looking at layers between us. This stuff is much closer than the background stuff, so we're looking at miles here. How high are these things? Well, I haven't had the time to actually measure, given the geometry, but based on other measurements from other Apollo data we've looked at over the years, I would not be surprised if ultimately these things turn out to be miles in height. The scale is the other clue that the civilization which did this did not use Mohawk Indians to put up skyscrapers on the moon. They built with nanotechnology, they built out of indigenous materials, which is glass, silicon dioxide, and they obviously used for energy the hyperdimensional torsion field manipulation, which is available if you know how to build the right technology to take advantage of the real physics. All of which is incumbent upon the Chinese choosing to reveal this stuff and yet not discuss it, not talk about it, not hold a press conference. Okay, we're a little closer here. Look at this astonishing level of organization and detail. This is not noise. This is real solid structure, albeit very faint and translucent based on sunlight scattering off what's sticking up above the current lunar surface. Now, remember those anomalous rocks that we talked about right after landing? Here's the lander, here's the little rover from the Pakan website, and here's this crater with these weird things lying around the rim. It doesn't take much imagination to realize that if these things are as anomalous geometrically and in color as they appear, and they're under this larger mega structure, which is in the process of falling apart, being bashed by meteors, and raining down on the surface over time, if you land underneath that structure and you happen to land next to a crater where the buried pieces have been tossed out again to lie just on the rim, you may see pieces of this ancient dome right in front of you, which you are then able to analyze. What was amazing is that the Chinese landed here on the 14th. And as you can see, they've got various timelines on this graph, which is from China, showing where the lander was, the rover rather, from the 15th to the 19th. Here it is on the 20th. Here it is on the 21st. Here it is on the 22nd. Why did it spend from the 15th to the 19th right there? According to the Chinese official government news agency, they had to take a time out. They had to put her into hibernation because of the high heat of the lunar noon. It is my suspicion, which I prove in the paper on Enterprise with a lot of other photographs that I didn't want to bore you with, that in fact the Chinese used this opportunity to secretly drive a few more feet and put that little sample gadget on the rover, the arm with the X-ray analysis instrumentation, directly on the rocks, which would have given them an in situ chemical and mineralogical and metallic mineral composition of whatever that stuff was. Like this guy. Does this look like a rock to you? Anyway, my thesis is that this stuff is in fact parts and pieces of the ancient dome, which has fallen to the surface, been excavated by new meteorite impacts from underneath the regolith, so that it's available in a kind of a sharp, angular fashion, broken bits and pieces of the glass with multiple layers and levels of this amazing structure which is arcing overhead. And what I did was I started looking at comparisons between certain materials on Earth called opalescent glasses and the structures on the moon. Notice that an opalescent glass will scatter blue light. If you look at it in transmitted light, the light coming through is orange or yellowish. And if you look at these objects, they look blue. Their shadows are rimmed by orange light, just like the opalescent glass, indicating to me that that's somehow part of their mineralogical structure. Such an artificial material, not a natural opal, of course, because opals cannot form under the moon under any circumstances because they require water to form, and there's no water on the moon. So, is this a manufactured material specifically tailor-made to filter and transmit light from the sun to shield the inhabitants under the domes from ultraviolet, from sunburn, from too much heat, etc., etc.? And do they have these marvelous optical properties as a side effect of their primary engineering raison d'etre? That, at the moment, is where I am. And what's really cool is the Chinese have announced that they intend to go to the moon and in 2017 bring back chunks of this stuff to military laboratories in China for analysis and duplication. I mean, the technological implications of finding an ancient ET civilization like this and being able to bring the pieces home is absolutely phenomenal. The other part that is phenomenal about this story is that there is a subtext that appears to involve not just what they saw from the lander and the rover, but what they have been clandestinely measuring, which mirrors to an amazing degree what we at Enterprise have been measuring for the last 20 or so years, which is the torsion field changes of the background ether under various astronomical events and phenomena. This is our instrumentation, the detector, the crystal reference, the tuning fork. The tuning fork inside this little Accutron watch vibrates normally at 360 cycles per second, 360 hertz. What Robin and I have found as we wandered around the world making measurements on pyramids and during eclipses and other astronomical phenomenon is that that background rate of 360 is not constant. And this is an actual data graph from our measurements of a total, an annular solar eclipse on the planet, on Earth, in May of 2012. Things get a little more intriguing now because if you look at this structure not only as a cache, meaning a marker, a repository of something valuable that whoever gets to the moon is supposed to find and bring back and put to use for all mankind. The other aspect of pyramids that we have now verified over and over and over again is they are able to produce a measurable amplification of a tremor in the force, i.e. a hyperdimensional vibration. This is now again Phil Stuckey's work. The planetary scientists have been doing the mapping for the Chinese lunar mission from Earth, from the United States. And this is what he found when he finally put all his data together as of a couple weeks ago. This is the final resting place of the little rabbit rover, which still wakes up every dawn and sends signals, but is no longer, the Chinese are telling us, able to rove around and go anywhere, including that long 3-kilometer trek they were talking about early on, because the wheel structure has had some kind of a short circuit, so it basically has no mobility, so it's stuck. Forevermore, it will be on the moon in this position, and there's the lander in its landed position. And the thing that struck me immediately was bing, 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 there's the pyramid. What are the odds that the little rover rabbit would get stuck exactly between? I mean, exactly. Here's a close-up. All right? Now, if there were some hyperdimensional measurements planned by this mission, which of course is signaled by landing at 19.5 and putting a big tetrahedron on your website, then maybe, I said to myself, the Chinese were intending to measure the hyperdimensional physics of the moon as we speculated in the paper that's on the Enterprise mission website. Well, that pyramid at 19.5 could have resonated with the hyperdimensional torsion field of the moon and been measured by these spacecraft arrayed in an appropriate geometric position to measure the first and second harmonics of the vibrations. That's why they're spaced 1/2 wavelength apart. Well, lo and behold, on April 15th of this year, a total solar eclipse occurred on the moon at the Chang 3 landing site. This is an artist's conception of what it would have looked like. Okay, this I think is Bonstell. No, it's David Hardy. Sorry, David. And it would be totally spectacular. There has been no data, not even a picture released by the Chinese of what would have been a stunningly visual tour de force. Their mission, taking the first photographs with modern technology, CCD technology, of what happens on the moon when a lunar eclipse takes place. But to my way of thinking, the real exciting part of what the eclipse could have done was very parallel to what Robin and I experienced when we looked at the eclipse in May of 2012 from the top of the Sandias, which are basically huge natural pyramids topped with 70 million year old limestone that's like 1,000 feet thick. And if you want a natural amplifier of torsion field energy, energetics, and waveforms, you need some kind of a natural amplifier to boost the signal so you can detect it with ordinary electronics that we have today. That turns out from our measurements to basically be one fundamental parameter that the pyramids on Earth do. They amplify the torsion field, and we are able to measure those effects. Now, this is me on top of the mountain with Robin as we're looking at the eclipse. Unfortunately, our photographer didn't really take any decent pictures of Robin, so I can't show you her looking at the eclipse, but she was there. This is the measurements I was doing simultaneously with the program and the sensors and all that. And this is before the eclipse, and then 2 minutes before first contact, all hell broke loose, and we got stunning data which looks like this. So we know from our own empirical measurements that when an eclipse occurs, if you have the right instrumentation, you can measure extraordinary things that will give you insights into this physics and how it's interacting between planetary and stellar bodies in the solar system. Well, on the 15th of April in 2014, the total eclipse of the sun from the moon, from this position, from the Chang lander site, occurred with the lander and the rover and the pyramid all in a straight line. And I'm now wondering if this early picture as they were coming around was basically a setup shot so they knew exactly where to position the rabbit, the rover, so that when the eclipse occurred, they would have put her in exactly the right spot to measure the double harmonics of the change of the field. Like here. Lander, rover, pyramid. Look at that. And the distance between this lander and the rover and the pyramid is such that you're looking at the second harmonic. Is this in fact what China did? And is this the reason why we've had no data from anything going on the moon, except for some very weird political ups and downs about is she alive or is she dead, which I'll be laying out in part 2. And is this all part of a cover-up by the official Chinese government to hide what the secret guys inside have been leaking in the way of bolstering what's really on the moon? And is this all part of some huge mega geopolitical maneuver by the Chinese to inveigle the West or to cajole the West or to threaten the West into doing something that in fact the West does not want to do. The best way to pull off a blackmail is to let the people that you're intending to blackmail know that you have positioned your assets in a way that if they do not agree, you will make what they do not want to come public amazingly public. What the Chinese have done by putting out these stunning images all over the web is to pre-position imagery assets of what is really on the moon. A, proving an ancient lunar civilization. B, proving that Apollo did go to the moon, and Stanley Kubrick did not fake the Apollo landings in a studio somewhere in Arizona or Nevada, and is the Chinese gambit, if we can call it that, basically saying we have put these images out there and all we have to do is hold a press conference and call everybody's attention to what is on them and everything changes. So if you don't want us to do that, then you have to accede to something we're discussing and negotiating and talking about in the back rooms. And isn't it interesting, in the last couple of months, we've had all kinds of very high-level representatives from the United States, including the President of the United States and the First Lady, going to China and the Far East and having fascinating meetings with the highest levels of the Chinese government, except the discussion points and the agenda and what they're talking about has never been made public. Are we on the verge of some major geopolitical breakthrough where our real history suddenly becomes known and a lot of things that are going on the planet now take a totally different turn, given that we know we have never been alone and we're part of something extraordinarily bigger than we are, and we're only waiting for official confirmation of our real history to change the turn and tone and direction of history. That's why when Jim asked me to come and do this one this year, I told him I had something really cool. You've now seen it. You now understand what's at stake, I hope. And what I will leave you with is one word before we go to questions, which is, well, two words actually. Stay tuned. Thank you.